I'm with Lisa Curtis, Director of the Indo-Pacific Security Program at the Center for a New American Security, which is a think tank in Washington, D.C. Ms. Curtis has been a foreign policy and national security expert with over 20 years of service in the U.S. government, including at the National Security Council during the Trump administration. And Derek Grossman, a senior defense analyst at the RANDCorporation, another think tank, a very well-known one. He's focused on a range of national security policy and Indo-Pacific security issues. He closely tracks the intensifying US-China competition, and Mr. Grossman has also served for over a decade in the intelligence community in Washington, D.C. during the Obama administration, where he served as the daily intelligence briefer to the director of the Defense Intelligence Agency, as well as worked in the National Security Agency and at the CIA. And today, of course, we're talking about this very interesting report at the Center for a New American Security, where Ms. Curtis works, and the report, which is co-authored by Lisa Curtis and Derek Grossman. It's called The India-China Border Tensions and U.S. Strategy in the Indo-Pacific. So that's a bit of a mouthful, but welcome, both of you. Lisa, you're in Washington, D.C., and Derek is on the Pacific. So I'm connecting the time zones very early in the morning for you, Derek, and Lisa. Still early, but not as early. But thank you so much both for joining me on ThePrint space.
Thank you for having us here.
Mm-hmm. These are your first comments on the report. And I do want to ask you, you've said right at the beginning that the India-China border intrusions, and this month in April marks 3 years of the India-China border standoff in eastern Ladakh. And right at the beginning of the report, you say that these border intrusions, both in Ladakh as well as lately in Arunachal Pradesh, could become and could threaten to lead to an all-out conflict between India and China. Why do you have this sort of pessimistic view?
Well, I think based on what we have seen over the last few years, really the border intrusions by China started back in 2013. We had this period from the late 1980s till 2013 when both sides were focused on coming to border agreements, confidence building measures, and it was relatively peaceful. However, going back about a decade is when we started seeing China becoming more aggressive and asserting its territorial claims and intruding across the border periodically. And then, of course, we had the most serious border incident in June 2020, when a couple months after the Chinese had built up their military forces along the LAC, particularly in 5 different spots, even crossing into territory that India claims, you had a clash where, for the first time in 45 years, soldiers actually died. 20 on the Indian side, at least 4 on the Chinese side. And so, that was a very serious incident. It changed India's approach to China. We saw India take several economic steps, putting restrictions on Chinese investments into India, banning, hundreds of Chinese apps, and also becoming more receptive to Quad cooperation. So it really changed, I think, India's perceptions of China. And unfortunately, 3 years later, while we have seen disengagement at several of the major friction points, we have not seen a return to the status quo ante of May 2020. So I think this is concerning. And not only that, we still have troops poised in the region. We have capabilities increasing at the border, but you also have tensions in the eastern sector. And we saw that in December of 2020.
But do you think that all this could lead to an all-out conflict between, that's kind of serious, isn't it?
It could. I think the operative word is could. I don't think either China or India want conflict. I think there's, some one-upsmanship going on at the border, but neither is seeking a full-blown conflict. But I think, we have seen that there can be loss of life, that tensions can increase, there can be miscalculation. So it is a risk. And the reason I think that we're saying, it could lead to this is really trying to get the attention of U.S. policymakers to focus on the dangers at this border. Over the last, 30, 40 years, most attention has focused on the India-Pakistan border and the risk of conflict there. But what I think Derek and I are trying to say is, look, U.S. policymakers, you need to pay attention to the India-China border. It's dangerous. It could erupt into full-blown conflict. That may not be a very high probability, but it is something that U.S. policymakers need to tune into.
Okay. So, Derek Grossman, your first views on this border standoff. It's 3 years. This April marks the third anniversary. The question here that we've been grappling with, and especially journalists like me, is why did the Chinese come in at all? What happened in 2020? Why did it all change so suddenly?
Yeah, thanks. It's a great question, and I don't know that there's an easy answer to it. I think there are theories out there. Some folks think they know the answer, but I don't. I'm not convinced of it. But one idea is that after the Doklam standoff in 2017 between China and India over the tri-junction point with Bhutan, and then India, deciding to turn back to the Quad with Australia, Japan, and the United States, that was one of the reasons why China viewed India as almost like a lost cause. And so, okay, well, if India is not going to join us in this greater push for making Asia safe for Asians, well then I guess we're going to have to do more against India, right, along the border and in other areas. That's one theory. Again, it's not proven necessarily. Another is that Prime Minister Narendra Modi's decision to unilaterally change the status quo of the Jammu and Kashmir territory, convinced Beijing that, well, Aksai Chin or other areas in Ladakh might be next. And therefore, we need to react preemptively as opposed to reactively to deal with the situation. I mean, another idea is that COVID kind of warped a lot of things, right? That, maybe China wasn't being affected as much by COVID. And so, decided that we're in a position of strength vis-a-vis India. They won't be able to respond as well. And so maybe we should take action now. I'll throw out a fourth theory, right? In 2021, well, this actually is after Galwan Valley, right? But in 2021, the Chinese put forward a new land border law that essentially encouraged citizens of the PRC to migrate to other areas that are disputed around China's periphery, right? So that may explain, what we saw with Tawang and with other friction points post 2021.
So, Lisa, the question to you is that Prime Minister Narendra Modi is coming to the US on a state visit in June. Now, what does the border standoff with China do to India's foreign policy, especially in the Indo-Pacific region? Do India and the US come closer together? Do you see this happening?
Well, I think that we already have seen a strengthening of US-Indian relations due to the pressure that China has been putting on the disputed borders with India. We really saw that in 2020. The US had pulled out all stops to support India. We increased intelligence sharing with India, expedited the delivery of winterized military gear, leased 2 MQ-9 surveillance drones to India. There really was a sort of increase in the cooperation. And I think this was important because I think in the past, Indian strategic thinkers had always thought, well, what if India-China tensions escalate? Is the U.S. really going to help India? Is this something they're really going to step up and do? There was a lot of doubt. And so I think that this situation dispelled that doubt. And it was helpful to the overall U.S.-India relationship and sort of enhanced the mutual trust in the relationship. So I think that has already happened. Now, with regard to Prime Minister Modi's upcoming visit to the U.S., I expect there to be some very positive deliverables on the defense and security front. They've been talking about co-producing jet engines. This would be a significant development if the U.S. agrees to that. And this was one of the recommendations in Derek and I's report, was that the U.S. does need to extend greater cooperation on high-tech military equipment for India to meet its needs. Because this is one of the advantages, of course, that China has is in the technology front and combining its technology capabilities with its military capabilities. So, I think it's significant that the US and India have already launched the ISET, the initiative on critical and emerging technologies, which was launched in January with the Indian National Security Advisor's visit here to Washington. I think we can see that will be extended. So yes, I think that you will see an overall improvement in the US-India relationship, a lot of initiatives announced during Prime Minister Modi's visit, and this will all send a signal to China. It may not, be a direct message, but it will be more subtle to China about the costs that China could entail if it tries to continue to nibble away at Indian territory by putting pressure on their disputed borders.
Okay, so, but the question, Derek Grossman, is that even if this sends a message to China, the point here is that India-China trade, especially over the last year, has actually gone up hugely in favor of China. So if you just look at the trade data, it's about over 25% increase in favor of China, and Indian exports to China have come down considerably. So what are we talking about? On the one hand, there is the message that the US allegedly wants to send, which is of friendship to India. But the India-China relationship is clearly, especially on the economic side, is clearly favorable to Beijing.
Yeah, and I think that's actually a broader problem with U.S. strategy in the Indo-Pacific. We really don't have an economic component of our strategy that is viable in competition against China. If you look at the last several years, dating back across the Trump administration and back through the Obama administration, we haven't signed any free trade agreements with anyone in the Indo-Pacific. To include India, right? And I feel like that is a major gap in our strategy. And China is if you look at a map of the Indo-Pacific and of the globe for that matter, right? Countries that even 10, 15 years ago were, their top trading partner was the United States, it's now flipped to China. Right. And China is the world's number 2 economy, soon to be number 1 if current trends hold by late 2020s, early 2030s. And so we don't really have a good answer to that. We obviously withdrew from the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement, the multilateral trade agreement. India was not a part of that, but I mean, it was a signal to India and the rest of the world that we are not really literally investing enough on the economic side in the Indo-Pacific. And India, for its part, was asked to join the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, the RCEP, which is ASEAN-led. China's in that. India said no. So, I mean, India, for its own reasons related to, Kashmir in particular and worries about Belt and Road Initiative. But the bottom line is we have not done well enough on the economic side to give India an alternative to trading with China.
Okay. Lisa, Derek earlier explained what he thought was why the Chinese tried to sort of change the border, or well, not even the border because it's a disputed border, but the line of actual control in 2020. You were mentioning how there was this incident in Tawang in December, and we see now just a few days ago that the Chinese have renamed, within quotes, 11 cities in Arunachal Pradesh. So what's the Arunachal Pradesh problem with the Chinese? I mean, they call it South Tibet. India claims the whole province, not just claims it, it is an Indian province. But what is it about the Chinese that they are so, sensitive about in Arunachal?
Well, that has always been a very sensitive area because of the historical links to Buddhism and the fact that it, has been involved in previous conflicts. I mean, if you look at the 1962 border war between India and China, that was one of the areas that China took over for a period of time. They ended up retreating from Tawang.
Why did they retreat from Tawang at the time in 62?
Well, I think it probably had something to do with the fact that the U.S. was prepared to support India. The US had offered armaments to India and was very clearly ready to help India in that war. And so I think the Chinese probably took note of that and did not want a sort of larger conflict that brought in a country like the United States. And that did contribute to them pulling back. Of course, they subsumed Aksai Chin and now control that area that India still claims. But they did retreat from Tawang. But I think that was because they did not want a broader war to develop. But the Tawang issue is important. Yes, one of the Dalai Lamas was born there. It's where the Dalai Lama fled in the late 1950s. So it's a very significant area, I think, for both countries. And it's been at the center of previous flare-ups between India and China, including in 1987. There was tensions in that area, and that is when India declared Arunachal Pradesh a state of India. So it's always been kind of at the heart of India-China border tension. So it's not surprising that we saw another flare-up there in December, and I don't think it will be the last flare-up that we see either. And it's interesting because China really started making a big deal about Tawang in the around 2007, 2008, when there was another, Tibetan protest happening right before the Beijing Olympics. There was a lot of problems that China was having with Tibet and the protesters there. So it also has something to do with their own internal stability and their own ability to keep a lid on tensions in Tibet. So I think, they externalize those concerns. And that's why we saw China starting to call Tawang South Tibet. It's a way to put pressure on India. Don't think about messing around with our internal problems involving Tibet. It's sort of a warning shot, I think, to India to back off of the Tibetan issue. Because, of course, there's over 100,000 Tibetans that live in India, the exile community. So I think there's multiple reasons that Tawang in particular is a source of tension between the two. And that's why it's so important for India to be, building up its infrastructure and its capabilities in that particular area.
Okay. Derek, the question to you is, you were an intelligence briefer during the Obama administration, but in the current Joe Biden, another Democrat administration, do you think things have changed? I mean, you're not in government anymore, of course, but what's your perception? Do you think that the relationship between India and the US has come closer in some ways? Is China the reason for that? And also, a lot of people here in Delhi say that actually, because of the Ukraine conflict, India and the US are not as close as they were. So can you perhaps marry these three sort of disparate strands, if you like?
Yeah. No, there's a lot of different ways to think about this, right? But I mean, my view is that US-India relations over the last really 2 decades have come an enormous distance in terms of the two countries strengthening their ties. And in the last few years, a lot of that is due to a common perception about the need to counter China. There's no doubt about it. But there are other areas not related to China where I think we have a lot in common. I mean, obviously, as the world's oldest democracy and India is the world's largest democracy, I mean, democracies like to interact with each other and have similar interests in that regard. So, I mean, I think that, and by the way, that was not inevitable because obviously during the Cold War, there was a lot of historical baggage in terms of India's leaning toward the Soviet Union and India's perception that we did not support India enough in the Indo-Pakistani wars and the war against China. But all of that has passed, and I think the last few years have actually been quite a bright spot in the bilateral partnership. And, there are certainly disagreements. And the thing that I worry about is that, China somehow reaches an agreement with India along the border, and that sets a new tone in the relationship that will then create some distance between the U.S. and India. There also, like you said, is the Russia-Ukraine factor. We still have CAATSA on the books. The Countering America's Adversaries through, Threat of Sanctions Act, right? And so, India has purchased Russian equipment, military equipment in the past that normally would have triggered CAATSA sanctions, but we have so far not gone forward with the sanctions, right? So that is still TBD. We in the United States are not too pleased with India's lack of support for our strategy vis-a-vis Russia, but I think the President Biden and his administration has demonstrated that they're willing to look past that in the greater interest of having India play a robust role in the Indo-Pacific strategy to counter China vis-a-vis the Quad and through other means.
But what is this robust role? I mean, India is constantly on the Quad, for example. India doesn't like the Quad to be described as a military alliance, which the other partners do. So how can India play this robust role that you talk about?
Well, I would actually dispute that the other three members of the Quad think it's a military alliance. I think they've consistently said that it is a security dialogue. There is no alliance in terms of there's definitely no
a security alliance. Basically, India doesn't want it to have this sort of security dimension. It's nervous about that, right? Or apprehensive.
I don't know about that. I mean, India's been pretty forward-leaning in terms of having discussions that relate either directly or indirectly to security. I mean, you can look at any number of the Quad leadership statements, and they've talked about growing concerns that the four countries have about keeping the Indo-Pacific free and open. I mean, it's pretty generic, but it's in there. You're not going to get India to mention, China by name or Taiwan or, but it's there, I think.
Mm-hmm. Okay. These are couple of.
They just don't want to talk about Russia in the context of the Quad. That kind of, sticks in our craw, I guess.
Sticks in the U.S. craw, is it?
Yeah.
Okay. The last couple of questions to you both. Lisa, to you, in your report, you talk about the India-China military balance. Now, we know that the economic balance is hugely divergent. China's economy is almost 5 times as large as India. But what do you make of the military balance? And also, if you can tie that up with the Pakistan question and this whole, especially in Delhi, the talk of a two-front war. One is the India-Pakistan, the perennial sort of proxy war across Jammu and Kashmir or the line of control, and now the India-China tensions.
Well, clearly China has the military advantage right now. And I think both sides know that. And I think that's one of the reasons that we see China being more aggressive on the border, right? They know they have the military advantage, the economic advantage, as you've already talked about. So for China, and that's another reason they don't want to exchange maps. India, has been saying, look, it's not demarcated. This is the reason our patrols keep bumping up against each other and causing this, higher level of tension. So why don't we exchange maps so that we know exactly where each other's perceptions of the line of actual control is? And China hasn't wanted to do that. And I think that's because they believe they have the military advantage. And so it's advantageous for them not to have the clarification so they can put pressure on India more easily. So I think, that is a major factor for China and motivation for why we have seen them in the last decade be more aggressive. I think they believe that the gap between India and China has only grown. And, right. And I think they're right. I think whereas, maybe 15 years ago, people said, India will be catching up with China. That's not what is happening. That's not what has happened. So I think China feels more emboldened to be able to take these aggressive steps. And, that's why I think India is starting to be more receptive to the Quad. You talked about, yes, India publicly does not want to talk about security cooperation,
Right.
Emphasize this is not an Asian NATO, it's not a military alliance. And of course, India won't have an alliance with any of these countries ever. But at the same time, we can't deny that security is on the minds of all four of these nations, particularly India, because of the border question, and that they are dealing on maritime security. There's a major maritime security initiative that the Quad has undertaken. So even though they say it's not a military alliance, let's face it, the security is on their minds, and there is security-related cooperation that is starting. And if necessary, they are building habits of cooperation that, were there the need to have a more public-facing military collaboration, they could easily step into this because they are building habits of cooperation. They're increasing their confidence and trust in one another on areas like critical and emerging technologies, supply chains, and those issues.
So last question to you both. I know you both have to go. In your report, you talk about implications for the US Indo-Pacific strategy and recommendations. Derek, some thoughts from you?
Yeah, I mean, we lay out a number of different ideas in our paper. And, first and foremost is to engage India more on the challenges at the border, whether it's providing military assistance, whether it is joint planning, whether it is being more vocal in multilateral fora to support India's interests along the border. And we haven't talked a lot about Pakistan, messaging Pakistan, ensuring that Pakistan does not try to open a second front in a new iteration of a China-India border war.
Has the U.S. done that? Has the U.S. done that? Has it messaged Pakistan?
I think Lisa would be more plugged in than I to answer that question.
Well, I would say, 1962, that's why Pakistan probably did stay out, because the U.S. did have a strong relationship with Pakistan, was able to prevail on Pakistan. And I would argue now this is a reason why, as much as India doesn't appreciate the U.S. having a relationship with Pakistan, this is one reason why it could be important. Not that the U.S. would resume military assistance to Pakistan. That is not what I'm talking about, but at least maintain some kind of influence so that in the event there was an India-China conflict, that the U.S. would have the influence to be able to, have Pakistan stay out.
But the question, Derek, is that in a potential conflict, God forbid there is one, but Pakistan and China have such a close tie. I mean, they describe their relationship as one that's higher than the mountains, deeper than the seas, and sweeter than honey. So there's no question who the Pakistanis will support in case there is an India-China sort of border war.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right that they support China, but what does that really mean on the ground? Does support mean just rhetorical support for China's position, or does that mean, actually opening that second front and causing India more problems? I think that we didn't, like Lisa said, we did not see that in 1962. And, my sense is, especially in, post Galwan Valley crisis, Pakistan kept its powder dry as well. So that, I think, is a good sign. That's actually kind of like a good news story embedded within our overall report. So hopefully that's a good ending to the interview for me.
Last comments from you, Lisa. The fact that although Pakistan did keep its border dry during the Galwan Valley incident, but the fact remains that, or would you say that the LOC, or the line of control agreement that we have had over the last couple of years, which keeps the LOC quiet, that also is helpful to keeping the India-China relationship or the India-China border more stable, would you say?
Absolutely. I think the LOC ceasefire is extremely important. And I think it's something that is in both countries' interests. It's in Pakistan's interest simply because they are facing multiple crises. They need an IMF bailout. The economy is doing very badly. They're seeing a resurgence of the Tehrik-i-Taliban Pakistan terrorist attacks inside Pakistan because of the Taliban takeover in Afghanistan. So they have political instability. So Pakistan has a lot on its plate. It doesn't need further problems, more problems. So I think the LOC ceasefire is in both Pakistan and India's interest, and hopefully it will continue to hold.
On this note, Lisa Curtis in Washington, D.C., and Derek Grossman in the Pacific region somewhere. Thank you both so much for joining me on the Print Debates. Thank you again for your thoughts.
Thanks. Take care.
Thank you.